Hello, it's good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school lesson. And this week, we start a new quarter, a new set of 13 lessons. And last week, we were in Paul's letter to the churches in Rome and trying to tie together a few things that we had seen over the previous weeks in our trek through the material of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then 1 Samuel. And of course, we are picking back up not too far from where we left off. We actually brought the text all the way up to 1 Samuel chapter 7, right before our week in Paul's letter to the churches in Rome. Although the text we actually looked at last time left us in 1 Samuel chapter 4. So we are going to be moving over now to 1 Samuel chapter 8, as you see on the screen, and of course, a little bit of 1 Samuel 10. And then next week, I believe we are moving over to chapter 12. But anyway, if you'll join me here in chapter 8, we'll read these verses and then we'll jump right on in, okay? So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have." Now notice this, it was a king to judge them. I'm going to dive a little deeper into that later on. When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. But the Lord told him, "Listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. They're doing the same to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but solemnly warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign over them." Now to chapter 10. Samuel took the flask of oil, poured it on Saul's head, kissed him, and said, "Hasn't the Lord appointed you ruler over his inheritance? Today, when you leave me, you'll find two men at Rachel's grave in Zelzah, in the territory of Benjamin," which you may remember from the Genesis story. This is very close to Bethlehem and Ephrathah. "They will say to you, 'The donkeys you went looking for have been found.' And now your father has stopped being concerned about the donkeys and is worried about you, asking, 'What should I do about my son?' You will proceed from there until you come to the oak of Tabor. 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you there, one bringing 3 goats, one bringing 3 loaves of bread, and one bringing a clay jar of wine. They will ask you how you are and give you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. And after that you will come to Gibeah of God, where there are Philistine garrisons. When you arrive at the city, you will meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place prophesying. They will be preceded by harps, tambourines, flutes, and lyres. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully on you, and you will prophesy with him, and you will be transformed. When these signs have happened to you, do whatever your circumstances require, because God is with you. Afterward, go ahead of me to Gilgal. I will come to you to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice fellowship offerings. Wait 7 days until I come to you and show you what to do." When Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed his heart, and all the signs came about that day. When Saul and his servant arrived at Gibeah, a group of prophets met him. Then the Spirit of God came powerfully on him, and he prophesied along with them. Samuel summoned the people to the Lord at Mizpah and said to the Israelites, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel out of Egypt, and I rescued you from the power of the Egyptians and all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from all your troubles and afflictions. You have said to him, 'You must set a king over us.' Now therefore, present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and clans." Samuel had all the tribes of Israel come forward, and the tribe of Benjamin was selected. Then he had the tribe of Benjamin come forward by its clans, and the Matrite clan was selected. And finally, Saul, son of Kish, was selected. But when they searched for him, they could not find him. They again inquired of the Lord, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord replied, "There he is, hidden among the supplies." They ran and got him from there. And when he stood among the people, he stood a head taller than anyone else. Samuel said to the people, "Do you see the one the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among the entire population." And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." Join me in a moment of prayer. Lord Jesus, our King, as always, we are grateful for your many, many blessings over the period of the week that you have given us as an interlude from the last time that we joined together in this space. For some who have viewed this lesson, or I perhaps should say the lesson that came before this, maybe it's only been a couple of days. But Lord, we are always appreciative of the things that you do that we know of, and of course, the things that we know nothing of. Thank you for giving us the time to set aside for the exploration of your word. And I pray that you would open our hearts and minds, and please help us to engage you in this space. Unlock for us the beautiful brilliance of the literary patterns and the design of how this story is structured in comparison to everything that's come before it, built upon that foundation. Help us to see how it leads into everything that comes after it. Help us to garner a deeper appreciation for how this fits into the beautiful fabric of the narrative that is the story of Scripture. And ultimately, Lord Jesus, how this influences the story that you stepped into, and what all this means for us in the time that you have given us to serve you in your kingdom as you have inaugurated it already. And we are waiting for its full consummation. We ask this, that you be glorified and our faith edified and challenged. In your name we pray. Amen. There are many things that we can cover here, and I'm going to try to hit on many of them, but there may be one or two that sadly I wind up leaving out. And of course, sometimes that's to my benefit, your detriment. Benefit only in the sense that when I teach this, it helps in preparation for me coming tomorrow when I will teach this actually in session on the church campus. And with that, of course, having only 45 to 50 minutes to work with, as opposed to the near hour and a half I will take with you. It requires me to be much more selective when teaching this in person, and of course, much more concise. And so some of you could perhaps appreciate that a little bit better. But I do appreciate the option and the ability to explore more of this with you here, even though I don't get to quite see your interactions, or I should say your reactions, and get the chance to interact with you. But anyway, having said that, I think the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we are recognizing something of the pattern that is being set up for us here in the story, and the salient points that the author absolutely wants us to catch on to, so that we can connect this to the stories that have come before, not just simply in narrative or literary sequence. Perhaps a better way of phrasing that would be chronological sequence. Not to simply say, well, this of course comes after the events of Moses and the Exodus and the wilderness wandering, and them, of course, concluding the Exodus with them entering the land, the period of the judges, and now Samuel is the transition between the judges and the period of the monarchy. That is a true and accurate series of statements, but that's not what I mean by that. What I mean by that, of course, is, as we've seen before, the cyclical patterns of things that have happened in the past and how they continue to happen, and how people are sadly not being changed in the transformative manner that the Lord would have them to, bringing to pass the words that Moses said as he ends his series of sermons in what we call the book of Deuteronomy, telling the people that not only has he, but also the Lord has concluded that these people are of stubborn and stiff-necked hearts, uncircumcised hearts that will not bend or yield unto the Lord, and they seemingly are on a one-way trajectory, though there are moments when they kind of pump the brakes and seem to take a detour that would turn them back in the direction, their hearts back in the direction of where their forefathers had been. And of course, modeling their faith after Abraham, and then later on David, heeding the words of Moses and understanding that their call is to honor the Lord and love him with all of their heart, worship him, forsake any and all other gods that are nothing more than demons. But even though there may be a brief detour, they eventually wind up coming back to this path, this trajectory that Moses has announced for them, that ultimately will lead them to being exiled from the land, from the new provincial Eden space. That's what I mean when I say these patterns, okay? So let's work on that. We isolated a little bit of this 2 weeks ago when we were looking at the material from 1 Samuel 4, and a little bit of material beyond that, all the way up to chapter 7. So at the beginning and the concluding pieces of chapter 3, It says in verses 1 through 4 that Samuel served the Lord in Eli's presence. And in those days, the word of the Lord was rare. Prophetic visions were not widespread. The Lord called to Samuel, and then he answers to him, "Here I am." And of course, that was after a series of 2 previous calls that same evening. And eventually, at the instruction of Eli, Samuel comes to understand that it's the Lord, not Eli, speaking to him. And this parallels Moses' own call, though, of course, Moses was an adult, and Moses was speaking to a bush that was not consumed by the flame that was seemingly engulfing it. And from it came the voice of the angel of the Lord speaking to him, saying, "Moses, and Moses." And of course, both of them respond with, "Here I am." And so it creates a series of textual links beginning with this that clearly start to show us, establish for us, that Samuel is going to be a new Moses figure. And we built upon that a little bit more by speaking about how in verses 19 through 21 of the same chapter, Samuel grows. The Lord was with him, as the Lord had told Moses that he would certainly be with him when he goes bravely into Pharaoh's presence, demanding that the God of Israel has required of Pharaoh that Pharaoh let his firstborn son Israel go. And of course, going back to Samuel, because the Lord has isolated him as a prophet, he begins to fulfill everything that Samuel speaks. And of course, from Dan to Beersheba, Samuel is confirmed to be a prophet of the Lord, and the Lord continued to appear in Shiloh, even though Shiloh suffered grave devastation in the days of Eli, with the ark being taken. And of course, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, Shiloh virtually being obliterated for a while yet. And at some point in their future, the tabernacle will be constructed. To what degree, we don't know, as we have no idea what was actually packed up and taken to Jerusalem when the temple was finished and Solomon dedicates the temple. In case you haven't noticed, today when we were actually reading through the text in which Samuel is talking to Saul, we have quite a few peculiar statements, such as this place that he is referring to as Gibeah of God. Gibeah is actually in Benjamite territory, and it's going to become the capital of Saul's kingdom, because Jerusalem has not been captured and won't be the kingdom's capital until David winds up capturing it many years later. But we know that Gibeah is also going to wind up being a particular place of importance later on in the future when Solomon goes there to offer up sacrifices. And it's interesting how this winds up becoming a place of prominence during the interlude between the time that this tabernacle is destroyed. And remember, Samuel is but a boy at that time, until Samuel at this point is an old man. And for the decades that he has ministered, again, we can presume the tabernacle has been reconstructed, but at what point that happens, we don't quite know. And in the intervening period in which it was absent from Israel, at what point did people start offering offerings there? Was there ever an interruption in people offering offerings there? Why is it that Samuel, in his circuit to go to different places, is offering sacrifices? And it seems like these are fellowship sacrifices, perhaps shalem, or what is sometimes referred to as peace offerings, in which case people do get the option to be able to enjoy that feast together. And certainly there are large communes when these things happen, because at the time in which Saul is made aware that he is going to become king, this is immediately after one of those feasts in which Samuel had invited Saul, and he gives them the select portion of the animal that is offered, and was kept aside to be given as a portion to Saul. So all that to say, there are lots of things going on here that should cause us to raise our eyebrows and wonder, why does this seem to be okay? If Samuel is the prominent prophet and he is part of the Lord's divine counsel, and of course the Lord is speaking through him and honoring, vindicating the words that Samuel says. That doesn't mean Samuel's perfect, but why is it that attention is drawn away from the tabernacle and it's never mentioned again after Eli dies and the tabernacle is destroyed in Shiloh, until the time comes when Solomon builds the temple, dedicates it, and then the tent of meeting is packed up and taken there. And ultimately, the Ark of the Covenant is installed there. That's quite interesting. But all that to say, again, Samuel, we have another picture here of him becoming a Moses figure. And then in chapter 7, We're told that Samuel judged Israel throughout his life. Again, this circuit between the cities of Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and he would judge Israel there at those locations. He would also go back to his hometown of Ramah, and he judged Israel there. So in this series of verses, at least 3 mentions of Samuel's ministry of judging the people. And the reason why this is important is not simply because Samuel is a judge. He continues on this legacy of people from Othniel all the way down to himself being the last judge. But as we've said before, just reminding you now, every one of these people were sitting in the seat of Moses. As we are told in Exodus 18, this is what he would do, sit down to judge the people. And obviously Jethro goes on to tell him, there has to be a more efficient way of doing this to free you up, and of course others to be able to be more productive in their daytime, as opposed to having to stand here all day long and waiting for you to render judgment. And of course, a hierarchy of judges is established over smaller groups of people and incrementally larger groups until eventually Moses sits at the head of the nation, and the most difficult disputes are what are brought to him. That's it. He doesn't have his own subset of people to have to administer judgment over. He presides over the nation in this very kingly fashion. And for the few people that proceed as prophets or judges, or perhaps both, Eli was a unique case in which he was the high priest and judge. They sit in the seat of Moses and render these judgments over the nation until Samuel takes over this spot. But as we saw from the story a couple of weeks ago, with respect to all that happens through the sequence of chapter 4 and the terrible conflagration between the Israelites and the Philistines, and the ark going into exile, the tabernacle being destroyed, Eli and his 2 sons dying, and basically the high priesthood being taken away from their house for a brief period, Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, will serve as priest. He's never really referred to as high priest, not that I recall, but he is a valid priest for several years under the tenure of David as king, and even into Solomon's tenure as king for a brief period until Solomon ultimately banishes him, and then Zadok from the line of Eleazar winds up taking over the position of high priest, and he was for a period serving alongside Abiathar as a co-priest. All that to simply say that through those events, we have the priesthood in shambles, and we have no idea how much time passes or what exactly made it clear who was supposed to succeed as the high priest after Eli wound up dying, since his 2 sons died. And granted, there are survivors that link the house of Eli to Abiathar, who is a descendant of Eli from Ithamar, of course, but, or I should say, a descendant of Ithamar through Eli. But that being said, the point I make is that the priesthood is in shambles, and the house of God destroyed, the ark in exile for a brief period of time, and the king-like figure who is the king priest in Eli, again, dead. And so all of these key positions seem to coalesce into one person, and that mantle is placed on the shoulders of Samuel, with the most prominent aspect of his role being to serve as judge over the people, to teach them, as Moses told Jethro, when I make decisions between one man and another, I teach them God's statutes and laws, because they come to me to inquire of me about God. So if Samuel is truly stepping into this Moses-like position, or I should say sitting in the seat of Moses, then he is exercising the full brunt of Moses's power in this capacity, given all that's happened leading up to these moments when Samuel steps into the light at the center point of the stage and becoming prophet, priest, and king as he judges the people. Then it's important for us to appreciate how this sequence has developed, because if we are looking at a pattern of peaks and troughs, and of course the peaks being the high points, when Israel seems to be working in very good, functional covenant partnership with the Lord, at the end of one of these judgment cycles, when they have repented of their sins and they've renounced the gods they have attached themselves to, that they have prostituted themselves with, and then they turn their hearts back unto the Lord, and then they begin this almost conquest under Joshua style campaign to rid the land of all traces. of the worship of these gods, which we saw under Samuel, did we not? Back in chapter 7, when he leads the people in victory against the Philistines. And we are told that the people begin to long for the Lord. And Samuel tells them, if you are sincerely turning your hearts back to the Lord, then as Joshua told the people, rid yourselves of these foreign gods that you are worshiping. And of course, turn your heart unto the Lord. That's what happens. The Lord gives them a resounding victory over the Philistines, and Samuel is exalted to this position of prophet, priest, king. So they are definitely at a high point. And if they are at a high point, what do you think is going to come next but a dip off into the valley? Okay, so that's what we should be appreciating, as goes the development of the pattern. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit to a text that we're really not going to expend much time on in our time in 1 Samuel in the weeks to come. But as Samuel is just about to bow out of the picture now, he's very old. He's not quite there yet, because we have to get through the period of time in which Saul disobeys the Lord the second time, and the Lord ultimately rejects him as king, and then of course uses Samuel to go and anoint David as king, and then eventually Samuel is going to die. But Samuel, before that period comes, in this very public fashion, seems to give something of what is often referred to in Scripture through a subheading as his farewell address, like those who have come before, namely Moses and Joshua. Others have given farewell addresses, but they were to much smaller audiences. And by that, I mean Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. Now we have these more prominent figures of Moses and Joshua speaking to the nation at large, right? So here comes Samuel in 1 Samuel 12 saying, as for me, I'm old and gray. My sons are here with you. Now it's important that we understand in 1 Samuel chapter 8, at the beginning of the chapter, we are told something very key about Samuel's sons. And I'm going to explore that a little bit lower than this at the bottom of the page. But I bring that up now because if you know, then great. If not, then we'll discover what that is here in just a second. And I'll make it clear as to why I have chosen to come to this text first, rather than the text that we are supposed to be reading as part of our lesson today. My sons are here with you. I have led you from my youth till now. Sorry, the right thing up here. I have led you from my youth until now. Here I am. Bring charges against me before the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox or donkey have I taken? Who have I wronged or mistreated? Who gave me a bribe to overlook something, and I will return it to you? But the people all say, you haven't wronged us. You haven't mistreated us, and you haven't taken anything from us. They responded. He said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is a witness that today that you haven't found anything in my hand. He is a witness, they said. Who he's talking to as far as the Lord's anointed? It's possible he could be referring to a person who is a priest. But again, we don't have anyone named as high priest at this point. That doesn't mean there isn't one serving as such. But the anointed person that he speaks of could very well be the high priest as candidate. Another person could be Saul, because at this point, Saul has been anointed and installed as king. But that aside, whoever this is something of an enigmatic figure, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is that Saul is saying, Samuel is saying, I have led you for this period of time, and you have nothing that you can lay at my feet as a charge against me that I have been crooked or dishonest and done anything other than render honest judgment amongst you and led you in a way that honors both the Lord and you. This is very similar to what Moses says at the end of his tenure in leading the people. When Deuteronomy 29, he says, I led you 40 years in the wilderness, and your clothes and sandals and your feet did not wear out. Now, granted, he's not going to go on and make any sort of claim like Samuel does, that I didn't wrong you, there was anything I took from you. If anybody has anything that they can lay at my feet, certainly others had accused him in the past. Korah probably would be one of the more prominent ones. But while that is the case, the Lord vindicated Moses at every turn, as Aaron was also vindicated, because both of them in this dualistic fashion were chosen by the Lord to execute the roles that were given to them by him over the people. But Moses goes on to basically paint the picture that he had faithfully led the people, and that the Lord had, just as Samuel is hinting at here, been gracious to them. And as Samuel has taken the position of judge, we hear the words of what Moses is saying at the beginning of Deuteronomy when he is recounting their journey from Sinai, he refers to it as Horeb, all the way to Kadesh Barnea before the 40 years of exile in the wilderness and before they rebel there at Kadesh Barnea. And one of the things that he says to them was kind of referencing back to the events of Exodus 18, when Jethro instructed him to consider placing judges over the people in groups of 50, 100, 1,000, and then Moses judge all of the nation if there was a case too difficult for any of them to be able to handle. Moses goes on to say that I commanded your judges at that time, those people that I appointed, to hear the cases between your brothers, judge rightly between a man and his brother, or his resident alien. So there are not to be differing standards for either a citizen, a person who is a blood descendant of Abraham, and of course your brother who lives amongst you in whatever tribe he is a part of, or a person who has come to reside amongst you from another country but lives in this land. You are to treat him as if he was a part of this nation. Do not show partiality when deciding a case. Listen to small and great alike. Do not be intimidated by anyone. Judgment belongs to God. And of course, bring me any case too difficult for you and I will hear it. This in every way feeds into what Samuel is talking about here, because that is the function that he has had to serve. There very well may be judges over the people who are still active in this capacity that Moses had established for them. We see something of that structure in place, I think, in the book of Ruth, with the case that Boaz is resolving in the 4th chapter with respect to establishing his role as the near kinsman, and the fact that the other gentleman chose not to do this. And the elders, of course, presiding as judge in the city gates, are officiating over this legal matter. Now, of course, this goes all the way back to Exodus 23, when we have the first reference of what the role of these judges is really supposed to be, when Moses charges them not to use the law as something of a codex, meaning you're going to find the exact precedent that you need here to rule in favor of whatever is going on here. But you have the rubric of the law as a guideline, a delineating right and left parameter to march between and understand the wisdom that God would have you implement in deciding what would be the right outcome to both honor God and render justice to the offended party or the one who needs justice. So that he tells them, do not deny justice to a poor person, stay far away from false accusation, do not kill the innocent and the just, because I will not justify the guilty. You must not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and corrupts the words of the righteous. Now, why is this important? Because we are going to go back to 1 Samuel 8 here in just a second. And when we do, this is the moment we begin to transition from the peak down through the valley into the trough. And 1 Samuel 12 doesn't bring us up out of the trough yet. We're not going to get to that until eventually the kingdom is taken from Saul. Saul dies on the slopes of Mount Gilboa at the hands of the Philistines. Actually, he takes his own life, but of course, this is because the Philistines are going to deliver that decimating defeat, and they are going to take his life if he doesn't do it himself. All that aside, then the kingdom transitions over to David as we move from 1 Samuel over to 2 Samuel. So we have a long way to go before we get ourselves out of this trough that we're about to enter into. So Samuel is saying these words here as he is giving his farewell address to the people and saying, basically, in essence, I have not failed you. So thankfully, as Samuel has been exalted, we haven't seen him go through this series of narrative steps to become the villain in the story, as others will, like David, who has quite an ascent until he gets to the top of that peak. And then, of course, with the events of 1 Samuel 8 all the way up through 11, really happening more so in 1 Samuel 11, we have David entering into the trough phase, in which he sharply descends into that valley, and all manner of things wind up going wrong, and his house is wrecked because of that. But while David is the instigator behind that, Samuel is not the instigator behind this phase of them repeating the simple pattern that happens before. Sadly, though, it's not too far from Samuel, because as we go back to 1 Samuel 8, on the heels of the words that we just read from Moses in Deuteronomy and Exodus, that judges are to be honest. They are not to be intimidated by others. They are not to take bribes. They are not to allow themselves to swear falsely or any of these things. They are to render right judgment because they are acting in the same way that Moses did. And of course, as Moses tells them, judgment ultimately belongs to the Lord. So you are acting as an agent for the Lord. So when we hear in 1 Samuel 8 that Samuel grows old and he appoints his sons as judges over Israel, and he's not doing this, I don't think, out of nefarious reasons, because he wants his son, or he's attempting a power grab here, kind of like Gideon did, when ultimately he has many, many sons and they wind up ruling after him. And one of those sons murders all the rest of them and attempts to try to appoint himself as king and is successful for a brief period of time. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think Samuel wanted to, much in the same fashion as Moses did in Numbers 27, praying, Lord, please do not let your people be scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Instead, raise up someone who will go out before them and lead them and will bring them back in. And of course, Joshua is the answer to that prayer, that he is hoping that his sons, and I'm guessing at this point he has trusted that they are the men that they of the caliber that he is and will lead like he does. He sets them up as judges to transition from him to them when the time comes and he dies. And his firstborn son is Joel, which basically means Yah is God. And his second one is Abijah, which means Yah is my father. So all that to say, the names of these men are quite comical when you consider what we are told immediately after this in the next sentence, because you would think they were named by his father for the sake of his relationship to the Lord, and that he would want his sons to mimic that as their names bear out, in embracing God as Father and trusting that he is God and that they will follow his lead, right? Instead, what we have here is that while they were judges in Beersheba, they did not walk in Samuel's ways. Instead, they turned toward dishonest prophet, which is incredibly reminiscent of Eli and his sons, and they took bribes and they perverted justice. And while those are just a handful of words and a fragment of a sentence, it underscores greatly just how egregious these actions were in the eyes of the Lord. If you go back and you tally up the narrative space that is present in the books of Moses that are dedicated to the actions of judges and various administrators, magistrates, and how, as we saw clearly in sampling those texts, they are to make sure that they do not do these things. They do not take bribes. They do not pervert justice. Then we can garner something of an appreciation for just how bad this is and why this angers the Lord. Okay, and immediately after this, we have what comes next, and that is the elders of Israel gathering together to Samuel at his base of operations in Ramah. And they said, look, you're old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us, the same as the other nations have. And this is quite key, same as all the other nations have. So the idea of them having a king, of course, will serve multiple purposes. Part of it would be to consolidate the tribes and to raise a standing army so that they no longer have to worry with the skirmishes that have happened in the cycle of the judges, which we haven't really read about happening in the time of Samuel outside of the one that happens at the sort of beginning of his ministry as a young adult, when the Philistines in chapter 7 came to attack and they were soundly defeated. But we will see here in just a second that there was actually a skirmish that was brewing on the horizon. It's just left out of this portion of the text, only to be emphasized later on. So a part of it, of course, is for militaristic and strategy reasons. But the real reason, or I should say perhaps the main reason that serves as the thrust behind this, is a king to judge, which this word judge is very broad. It means several things, one of which, of course, is lead the people. And of course, we can appreciate that in the sense of a military commander. But we also have to understand that this word judge is the same that is used in all these other contexts that we've referenced already with respect to Exodus 18, Moses judging the people, setting up others to judge, using some of the authority that he has and that he has now vested in them, and various other things of the like. And even other earlier portions of the text going back to Genesis and how judgment was rendered. As Abraham calls on the Lord when he is receiving the news directly from him that he is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham, afraid that the Lord is going to swallow up the righteous with the wicked, says, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? The same Hebrew word, shaphat, is exactly what we have here in play. So all that to say, this is a direct, tangible link to what Samuel has been doing. And as we've seen, there is a very clear contextual relationship between what Moses was doing and his role over the people or amongst the people, and Samuel doing virtually the same thing as a new Moses figure. So they want a king to now take over the role as the Moses figure, but they want him to serve in that capacity as other nations allow their kings, or I should say, as other kings preside in their over the other nations. And that's important, because if you fail to realize the significance, then you're going to have to wind up going outside of the Bible. In some cases, there is information that comes to us in the scriptures about other kings over the nations that surround Israel at various times. But much more information, obviously, is going to come from sources outside the Bible that help us understand just how these nations accorded their kings and the power that they wielded over the people. And in some cases, they had the combined role of being both prophet and priest, which is not too dissimilar to how we see some of these figures serving or presiding as king over Israel. And certainly we've already explored how this was part of God's original ideal when you consider Adam in the garden, that temple-like setting with the words given to him of work and guard or watch or keep in Genesis 2:15, depending on your translation, coming from the Hebrew terms avad and shamar. All that to say, Adam was a king priest. And of course, David even serves as something of a king priest at various points. We'll get to that later on. All that to simply say, though, this is part of the reason why Samuel is rubbed so wrong by how these people demand that he appoint a king over them, and for the reasons that they demanded. I'm sure many of us have felt the tension sometimes between the text of Deuteronomy 17 and the outlining of the requirements in Torah for the king, and of course the anticipation that is quite clear in that text that there will come a time when a king is to be appointed over the people. Granted, Moses speaks of it in terms of them wanting or longing for a king, but he doesn't denounce such a thing. He doesn't tell them they are forbidden from having a king. And certainly when you consider backing this up all the way to Genesis 49 and the messianic promises that are given to the descendants of the line and tribe of Judah, that obviously there is going to be a king that comes from that line, and it won't be just the people of Jacob that will give their allegiance to him, but the obedience of the nations will be his as well. So how does that happen if a king isn't supposed to be anticipated arising from within Israel? We have Balaam's prophecies and the idea of this messianic figure, a king being greater than Agag, who will ascend like a star. So there obviously is anticipation a king will arise. And we wonder then, well, why is Samuel so disturbed by this? And better yet, maybe if he had something of an understanding of when and how a king was going to arise, and yet he comes to inquire of the Lord, why does the Lord seem to make such a condemning statement? As if to say that the Lord sees this as a rejection of him, and yet he allows for them to have a king that ultimately converges on David's ascendancy to the throne. And we're going to unpack that a little bit, but to have a king to judge them as the other nations do is evil in the sight of both the Lord and Samuel for what they expect this king to do in judging them. They understand how the kings of the surrounding nations judge and lead them, and this is what they want, something similar to that. They are not seemingly reaching out for a king in the fashion of Deuteronomy 17, who, if you read that very short synopsis, is a king who is greatly restricted by the law. He's not to elevate himself in his heart above his countrymen, meaning treating them as if they are second-class citizens or even non-human. He is to be a total Bible nerd, spending much of his free time copying the words of Moses and doing so in the presence of the Levites and entrusting that copy to them. And then they, of course, probably inspecting his work to make sure this is true to what Moses has said and not redacting or retconning those words to make it fit his ideal of what both the kingship and the priesthood and, of course, his role over the people should be, and changing those words for his posterity to give the king more power than he's supposed to have. And, of course, not doing things like amassing many wives or many horses for himself and building a massive military complex or any of those things, right? They understand that the kings around them do all of those things, that the kings around them subjugate their peoples and exploit them to prop themselves up with the power that they so easily and frivolously wield over the people, and on and on. And this is what is shameful, as goes their request. So anyway, moving beyond that to verses 6-8, when they said, give us a king, of course, Samuel, as I said, considers this wrong, but when he inquires of the Lord says, give them what they want. In other words, turn them over to the consequence of their demand. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day. Referencing the Exodus yet again. But notice here, what we seem to have is something of a textual link back to the moment when in Numbers 14, the people are corralled there at Kadesh Barnea. Numbers 13 was the chapter dedicated to the spies being sent into the land to tour it for 40 days. They go up to Hebron. They see the spot probably where Abraham and many of their patriarchal fathers and ancestors were buried. And they sample from the produce of the land in the valley nearby, taking this cluster of grapes from Eshcol, and they bring it back. And instead of giving the wonderful report that they should have given, instead, they do attest to the fact the land is abundant, but they just simply can't take it. They do not believe the Lord will be faithful, upholding his end of the bargain and delivering their enemies over to them. And so they complain and they say, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. So why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword and our wives and children to become plunder? Even though that none of these words are close in similarity, or I should say in style, to the words being said here in 1 Samuel 8 by the people, give us a king to judge us, or your sons are not like you and do not walk in your ways. So we reject the plan that we have moving forward. And that is, we've had hundreds of years now of people being elevated by the Lord or isolated as key figures to rule over us. And notice Eli was never one the Lord chose. We have no record of that. And we don't even have a record of the Lord choosing Samuel's sons. It seems that Samuel chooses them, and that's not necessarily something that we should be faulting Samuel for. It's as if to say he was perhaps making preparations at this stage in his life for what was going to come next, hoping that if there was some measure of stability between one generation and the next, there wouldn't have to be a passing away of a judge, the people slipping off into apostasy again, and then the Lord having to raise another judge like Samuel after the people have went through another cycle of this. Perhaps this would be something that would prevent them from doing so, much in the same way between Moses and Joshua. There was not a lapse or a falling off or falling away of the people. However, the people reject this plan, and not for terrible reasons, because again, Samuel's sons are not honorable men, but instead they reject the whole idea together of the way this has worked so far, and they don't want to wait for the Lord to give them direction. Instead, they want a king and the established practice of progenitor to rule and guide their fates moving forward, vesting the power in the king that all the other nations do in their king. So much in the same way that the people have rejected the Lord's plan in Numbers 14, as they have denounced the Exodus, we don't want what God's plan, his ideal, his agenda for us is. We have a better option, and that is to just simply go back to Egypt. And what do they want? But a leader to be appointed over them who will execute this plan. take them back to Egypt, lead them into bondage. And if you consider the idea, when the people say, give us a king to judge us as the other nations have, or as we will see, judge us as the kings of the other nations do. What exactly is Samuel about to communicate to them other than what you are asking for is to be led back into bondage? This is what the Lord has delivered you from. Hence the reason why the Lord seems to bring this up when he says, from the time I brought them up out of Egypt, they have been rejecting the plan that I have had for them. And they have wanted to prostitute themselves with other gods and so forth. Their allegiance has been to anyone else other than me. And it's no different in this moment now. So again, we have clear signals in the context that we are about to enter back into a trough phase, or the cycle is going to repeat itself in which the people are about to fall away. So continuing on with 1 Samuel 12. So we just took a break from 1 Samuel 12 and went to 1 Samuel 8. Now I'm briefly bouncing back to 1 Samuel 12. I'm going to read verses 8. See here, I have a typo down here, and I'm not sure what that is. Anyway, 8 through 12. When Jacob went to Egypt, your ancestors cried out to the Lord, and he sent them Moses and Aaron, who led your ancestors out of Egypt and settled them in this place. It's amazing how many times every one of these prominent figures want to go back to the Exodus story. And why is that? Why do they draw this up? Because they want the people to understand this was what God was doing in reestablishing you as a new Adam in the new provincial Eden space, reigniting the Eden experiment to fulfill God's promise to Abram in Genesis 12 to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. Remind them of that, because this is what they are selling themselves short of. But they forgot the Lord their God. So he handed them over to Sisera, the commander of the army of Hatzor, to the Philistines, to the king of Moab, and these enemies fought against them. Then they cried out to the Lord. It's important that we understand every time this phrase is used, it carries us all the way back to the beginning chapters of Exodus. It's meant to be a textual link back to the Exodus in which the people have wandered from the Lord. They are in some phase of exile, whether in the land promised to them or outside the land promised to them. And when they cry out, the Lord often remembers in mercy the covenant he made with their forefathers. And in this period of repentance and renewal, that God seems to do something of an Exodus-like movement amongst them and lead them into a new phase, almost a new creation. It's not always the same picture seen in the idea that whole armies are decimated and the land wiped clean and they get to go in and inherit towns and wells and vineyards and orchards and all these things that they didn't have before. Instead, it could be just a revival phase in which the people are turning their hearts back to the Lord, and the Lord is then delivering them from their enemies. And moving forward, he begins to bless them, and crops are abundant and various things of the sort, right? Anyway, they cried out to the Lord, we have sinned, we have abandoned the Lord, we worship the Baals and the Ashtoreths. Now rescue us from the power of our enemies, and we will serve you. So the Lord sends them, this is the alternate name for Gideon, Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, Samuel. And he rescued you from the power of the enemies around you, and you lived securely. But when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was coming against you. So this was part of what was missing from the context earlier when the people were demanding a king, because there is another military conflagration on the horizon. And now the people are deciding, we don't want you or your sons leading us into battle. We instead want a king to go before us, to lead us into battle, but also not to just simply serve as a militant commander, but to judge us as the kings of the surrounding nations judge their peoples. You said to me, no, we must have a king reign over us, even though the Lord your God is king. Now, why is this important that Samuel sums all of this up as he does? Because I think that there are quite a few textual links that goes back to what Moses, again, in Deuteronomy, was saying as part of his very long and drawn out farewell speech to the people, when he is recounting their trip from Horeb, again, Sinai, all the way up to Kadesh Barnea. Now notice Moses gives us differing information here than what we have back in the Numbers 14 text, much in the same way that the author of the Samuel account in this later chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 8, is the account where we have the people demanding a king to judge them because they reject Samuel's dishonest and unjust sons. But now when we move to this text a few chapters later in 1 Samuel 12, we are told there was another reason, and it was also because the king of the Ammonites was coming against them in battle, and they wanted a commander over them, a king to organize an army, an army apparently. So now in Deuteronomy 1, we have Moses giving us additional information, because in Numbers 14, we are told the Lord told Moses to send out spies, one from each tribe. But Moses tells us here that they came to him with a plan. And seemingly Moses goes to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord blesses off on this, telling him essentially what God had told Samuel when when Samuel inquires of the Lord about their demand for a king, and he tells them, give them what they want. The Lord is here telling Moses in Deuteronomy 1's account of this, of what actually occurred in Numbers 14, give them what they want. They want people to go spy out the land. This is how we'll do it, right? So he said, see, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Don't be afraid. Go and take it. Then all of you approached me. See here, these people approach Samuel and say, no, we want a king over us, just as they did with Moses, approaching him and saying, okay, we know that the Lord wants us to take the land, but this is our plan. So let's send men ahead of us to explore the land, on, and bring back a report of what's supposed to happen. Now, he goes on in the verses moving past this point. Samuel says in chapter 12, now therefore present yourselves and see this great thing that the Lord will do before your eyes. Isn't the wheat harvest today? I call on the name of the Lord, and he will send thunder and rain so that you will recognize what an immense evil you committed in the Lord's sight by requesting a king for yourselves. And it isn't just Samuel's opinion that it's evil, because he does this straightway. He calls on the name of the Lord, and the Lord sends both thunder and rain as a sign, vindicating the words of Samuel that indeed the Lord agrees with Samuel's assessment. This was evil. Notice the response. As a result, the people greatly fear the Lord and Samuel. They plead with Samuel, pray to your God, to the Lord your God, for your servants so that we won't die. For we have added to all our sins the evil of requesting a king for ourselves. Go back to Moses's accounting of what happened in Numbers 14 when he gives this additional account in Deuteronomy 1. You were not willing to go up. You rebelled against the command of your Lord. You grumbled in your tents and you said, the Lord has brought us up out of the land of Egypt to hand us over to the Amorites in order to destroy us because he hates us. And you answered me after this rebellion, when the Lord then speaks to them and tells them that none of them will enter into the land. You answered in response, we have sinned against the Lord. We will go up and fight as the Lord our God commanded us. Then each of you put on his weapons of war, thought it would be easy to go into the hill country. But the Lord said to me, tell them, don't go up and fight, for I am not with you to keep you from being defeated by your enemies. Essentially, this is what you wanted. You didn't want to go into the land. You did not want me going in with you to hand your enemies over to you. So I'm giving you what you want. You will stay outside the land. I will not be with you. When you go up to fight these enemies that you presume you will beat, I'm going to deliver you into their hands. And this is how it will be until, again, all of your corpses lie spread out all over this wilderness. Essentially, this is exactly what Samuel is telling the people. Not so much the idea that their corpses are going to litter the ground, and thankfully God does not send a plague to decimate them, but they recognize they have committed a grave sin against the Lord. As they said, we've added this sin to our heap of sins already, basically, in demanding a king. We recognize that what we have done is wrong. But now I pair this up with the Deuteronomy accounts for one simple reason, because Samuel responds to them by saying, don't be afraid. Yes, it's good that you recognize what you've done is wrong. But even though you committed this evil, don't turn away from following the Lord. Instead, worship the Lord with all your heart. Don't turn away to follow worthless things that can't profit or rescue you. They are worthless. And shortly after what Moses says in Deuteronomy 1, recounting the events 40 years in the past with that previous generation in their rebellion, that he then goes on to tell these people one of the most important things that they will remember moving forward, and that is the Shema, Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you are to love him with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. A few verses later, fear the Lord your God, worship him, take your oaths in his name, and do not follow other gods. So all of this to simply say, Moses is bowing out of the picture. Back to the Samuel narrative. Samuel is bowing out of the picture. Part of what Moses was doing as he was bowing out was to remind them of the egregious acts of their rebellion and how the Lord was both just and yet merciful, and yet encourage the people moving forward. Don't repeat those mistakes. Don't turn your heart away from the Lord, and do not turn to idols, worthless things. Samuel is saying, yes, what you have done is evil, and the Lord agrees, but do not let this deter you from following the Lord with your whole hearts. Give yourself fully to him. Do not turn to worthless things, as you have been doing for centuries now, repeatedly, generation after generation, as the Lord has raised up judges, and yet you've done the same thing over and again. Because as I am going to hand the reins of leadership over to the king that the Lord chooses out from amongst you, this is what you could easily expect, is that you might, at this junction in your history, choose to move in that manner, in that fashion, toward this avoidable outcome, and that is another round of apostasy. So all of this connecting the links again with Samuel and Moses, and appreciating how Israel is about to repeat a cycle that they have already repeated so many times in generations that have preceded them. It's important to understand how this is developing in the book of Samuel, because we're going to see how the Lord responds to this. And we do this through the lens of the prologal material that came to us in the opening chapters of 1 Samuel, especially with the backdrop of Hannah's words in the first 10 verses of chapter 2, when we hear of this paradoxical dichotomy of the Lord exalting those who are debased, those who are humble, and those who no one seems to care about, and completely undermining the power structures of all the nations around, basically, and certainly within Israel, and debasing those who have exalted themselves. And he will elevate those who are exalted in his sight and by his hand to positions and thrones of honor. And he is going to give his strength to his king, and he is going to elevate the horn of his anointed one, right? So, of course, this is anticipating the arrival of a king at some point. And we are looking toward the future to see how, through yet again another cycle of Israel slipping away, seeking after things that they should not be, going after the way of the other nations rather than being the peculiar people that God has called them out and carved them out to be, following him in the wisdom and light of his counsel, and then attracting the other nations to do so, that through this, God is going to implement yet another system through which God is going to bless, but ultimately prove to the people that it's not going to be through one of their own, as goes a broken human being who will only seek their best interest at some point in their story arc, but ultimately his anointed one, his Messiah figure, who they have yet to understand and fully see, as no prophet has arisen amongst them to give them the depth of information that men like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel will. But certainly in future generations, the words of those prophets will spell out a much, or I should say, shape up for them a much clearer picture of someone no other than God himself taking on human flesh to be this Messiah figure amongst them. But anyway, let me digress, bring this back down to the text itself and where we're at. Because what is about to happen here in just a second, when we follow on with the words that God has instructed Samuel to do, when he tells them, give the people what they want, they rejected me, make sure that when you give them a king, you warn the people of what the king's rights will be. Now, as we've already done, we're going to do yet again, but at a much earlier point in the story, we're going to see how this feeds off of a series of patterns that have already come before, okay? Because in Genesis 45, when the people originally left Canaan and went to settle in Egypt under Joseph's tenure as basically second in command or king of the land for all intent and purpose under Pharaoh, after the whole debacle of Joseph revealing himself to his brothers, and they all have this moment of reunion, reconciliation briefly, then Joseph tells the people he is going to convince Pharaoh to allow them to move down into Egypt and resettle there, and then to give them the best of the land. So first in verse 10 of Genesis 45, Joseph speaks and he says, you can settle in the land of Goshen and be near me, you, your children, grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. And then in verse 18, Pharaoh saying the same thing, but adding to that, when you and your families come back to me, I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, which of course is Goshen. And you can eat from the richness or fat of the land. And that word fat, of course, being a reference here, while it's not firmly linked yet, it will be later on. But I guess in some brief way or small way, it does actually allude back to the story of Abel and Cain, when Abel offered his blood sacrifice, and what he burned on the altar was the fat of the animal, which is the best portion and what is reserved for the Lord under the Levitical sacrificial system. And so the same word there is what's being rendered here as richness, or the best of the land, because the best part of the sacrifice given to the Lord is the fat portion. So anyway, best of the land. And of course, when Egypt starts to bud and blossom again, once the famine is over with, they will be enjoying more of the fatness of the land than anyone else will be. And then a little further down in verse 23, he sent his father the following: 10 donkeys carrying the best products of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys carrying grain, food, and provisions for his father on their journey. So a sampling of what is to await them in Egypt. And even though, again, the land is experiencing famine, in the future it won't be, and they will reap the abundance of the land. In other words, Egypt becomes something of a quasi-Eden for them for a period of time. It's something of a prototype of what the Lord intends for them to experience once they leave Egypt through the Exodus and then go back to the land that God had swore to give Abraham and to pass down to his descendants and make it a new Eden for them. Moses goes on to tell them in Leviticus 26 and the parallel passage of Deuteronomy 28 that if you walk faithfully with the Lord, you can experience Eden blessing. You have the promise of Eden abundance, right? He says, I will give you the rain at the right time, and the land will yield its produce. Trees will bear their fruit. Threshing will continue until the grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until sowing time, because there will just be so much that you will have all that to actually harvest and to squeeze into wine. And imagine how much wine could be produced from all of that. I will give peace to the land. You will lie down with nothing to frighten you. I will remove dangerous animals. No sword will pass through your land. You will pursue your enemies. They will fall before you. 5 of you will pursue 100. 100 will pursue 10,000. Your enemies will fall by the sword. I will turn to you, make you fruitful, and multiply you, the promised blessing of both Adam and Abraham, and confirm my covenant with you. You will eat the old grain of the previous year and clear out the old to make room for the new. Buddy, it will be Eden. All that to simply say that when we go back to the story of Joseph, that after Joseph dies and we leave the context of Genesis to go into the context of the next book, Exodus, what do we have but a new king who did not know about Joseph, who came to power? And as we read this passage, we come to understand that he works the people rather relentlessly. It's said here that he does so ruthlessly. And what he does is he assigns taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor, to build supply cities. And of course, it doesn't have quite the effect that he wants. The more he works them, the more they multiply. And so he knuckles down and he oppresses them even more, working them ruthlessly. He makes their lives bitter with difficult labor, brick and mortar, all kinds of field work, and they ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. And it leads the Israelites to groan because of their difficult labor. They cried out, the first instance in which we have the people crying out to the Lord, and the Lord responds. And God heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant. And of course, he winds up sending Moses the deliverer. Now, pay attention, because this is hugely important for when we follow on in 1 Samuel 8. Yep, we're right back there to our heart text, or where we were primarily at the initial point of our lesson. Samuel goes on to tell the people that when a king is appointed over you, and mind you, at this point, he has not appointed Saul to be king yet. These are the rights of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and he will put them to use in his chariots, on his horses, or running in front of his chariots. He can appoint them for his use as commanders, or commanders of thousands, commanders of fifties, to plow his ground, reap his harvest, or to make his weapons of war and equip them and the equipment for his chariots. When he says that he can take your sons and appoint them to do any of these things, granted, some of this may sound like positions of prestige, as goes being commanders over military units, but to run in front of chariots, these are the kind of things that servants do, slaves do. He can take your daughters to become perfumers, cooks, bakers. He can take your best fields, vineyards, olive orchards, and give them to his servants. Now, that is a huge departure away from what God was promising the people under his tenure and rule as king. And when he says, if you will be faithful and obey me, walk in the wisdom and light of my counsel, everyone will have his own vineyard, his own orchard. And of course, God has picturesquely described exactly how the abundance of the land will be produced for them. So it will basically be everyone's own little slice of Eden, as the entire land has become a new Eden for everyone, and the nations beyond Israel eventually will begin to experience the abundance of that blessing as Israel continues to draw closer in marital covenant faithfulness with the Lord. But notice here the king, in taking the best of their orchards and vineyards and giving them over to his servants. What does that sound like to you? Nothing more than a tyrant, an oppressive king like Pharaoh was over Israel when they were living in Egypt. And he assigns all of these taskmasters over them and begins to oppress them as slaves. And granted, they may continue to live, or may have continued to live, in Goshen. But I would imagine that whatever was produced in Goshen, as it being the best or the fattest portion of the land, was not something that they got to reap or appreciate very much as slaves. It would be very difficult to imagine a scenario in which Pharaoh has all of these things produced abundance-wise in a province like Goshen, but gives this to the slave population, and he is powerless to do anything about it, or chooses not to do anything about it, when he can easily take all of this from them, feed them meager scraps of food, just enough to keep them alive and able to do the work that he forces them to do. And of course, keep all that is produced in Goshen, and that they probably work themselves to the bone to produce for him, to take it from them and use it for himself, or of course to give it to his servants as he chooses. Going further, he can take 1/10 of your grain in your vineyards and give them to his officials and servants. He can take your male and female servants, your best cattle, and your donkeys, and use them for his work. So everything that was a sign of abundance for you now will be stripped from you and taken by the king. And he can take 1/10 of your flocks. That, of course, is what belongs to the Lord. But the Lord is not going to relinquish what belongs to him to give to this human agent that rules as king. The Lord will still be due his 1/10, because that 1/10 will have to be given over to the Levites to support them, right? And you yourselves can become his servants, meaning his slaves. You will be enslaved by the king. All of this is a very long and drawn out picture of the people being siphoned off back into bondage within the land. All of this, even though a king has not yet been crowned and anointed to rule over them. This is exactly what Samuel is warning them of, and his warning is a very familiar horror for them, though it's been centuries since they experienced this. He is describing the very same circumstances that the people had to endure when they were living in Egypt, and now Egypt will become what they are living under in the land that God promised them. The Eden space is going to become like Egypt, with an oppressive Pharaoh-like king ruling over them. And the final warning to cap all this off, that when that day comes, you will cry out linking this back to this, when God heard their groaning, you will cry out because of the king you have chosen for yourselves, because of his oppression over you, but the Lord won't answer you on that day. He will not bring deliverance for you on that day to relinquish you from the burden of having to live under the tyrannical rule of this Pharaoh-like king. And as we'll see in the weeks to come, this is exactly what Saul winds up doing. He does wind up press ganging nearly every soldier or every man who looks like he could be a good soldier, who exercises prowess and promise. He conscripts them into his military fighting force, his army. And of course, he does construct something of a palace to live in that I won't say was abandoned. We don't really have any record or mention of it beyond Saul's life as to whether or not it was given over to some of his family members. After all, those possessions were kept in his family through Mephibosheth for some time later on. But all that to simply say that he started exacting the very rights that were privileged to him as king, in feeding all of these servants that kept his palace going, and the administrative duties that were handed over to him, because that staff continues to help the kingdom that Saul ruled over limp on for nearly 7 years after Saul dies under the tenure of his last and only surviving son, until David ultimately becomes king over a consolidated Israel. So even though he doesn't oppress the people fully to the extent that we have this picture given to us by Samuel, it does become something of the moniker that many kings who follow on after David will begin to oppress the people in similar fashion. And we will see this being true of even Solomon. So what is the Sunday school application of this? And I use that term loosely because we know what we're used to with Sunday school, I suppose, is always something that I can take from this that helps me see where do I fit into this and how does this apply to me. Again, as I've tried to help educate in the past, much of the Bible is not written with the idea of personal application in mind, that there's some sort of specific command that I'm supposed to take from this and put that into practice in my life. There can very well be wisdom, as there is wisdom all over the scriptures for us to understand from this. And what I would simply say is that yet again, we have the people of the Lord slipping away from him and choosing in their heart that is crooked, corrupt, bent on rebellion, and as of yet is not, as Moses said would come in the future, circumcised and bent to want to, out of love, follow the Lord, as Moses had tried to encourage them to do so many times over before he departs from them, dies, and leaves them under Joshua's charge. That has not yet happened, but the Lord has continued to be faithful to his people, even though we have a dire warning that he won't respond to them when they call out to him in that day, when they realize the horrors of what they demanded and having a king set over them. Yet the Lord in his graciousness will eventually respond by raising up a king from the negative circumstance they've created, the crisis they've brought on their heads. God in his faithfulness and in his mercy will bring about the antithesis of what is promised here through a Messiah-like figure. In all essence, he really is a Messiah, because David is an anointed one, and David is the epitome of all the kings that will come after him as he becomes the icon they are all measured against. And of course, the very king that Messiah is compared to, that the people can expect, but of course, he will be a far greater manifestation of what David was in his best of years when he followed the Lord. And this is the reality of which we live under. We live under the rule and tenure of this Messiah as king, and we appreciate the dawning of the final Exodus as all of humanity is being called away from exile into his glorious kingdom that he has inaugurated. And we have the exciting thrill of knowing he is not yet consummated, that while evil is around us, it's ever present in our daily lives at so many different levels of existence. Yet still, we have the promise that one day, ultimate righteousness, peace, and mercy and justice will rule and completely extinguish and forever vanquish all evil.
And you and I have the beauty of participating in this promise now by helping people see the inaugurated promise. And that means it's begun, it's not finished, but it's begun in us and even in the world around us by helping other people see the beauty of what life is like, not under a tyrannical, oppressive king who power grabs, um, or I should say, grabs power at every turn in the road that they can. And even though we have many people who preside over us as governmental figures and officials in our own land who do these sorts of things, yet still, we are not subject to them ultimately. We are subject to the King of Kings, who rules right now at the right hand of the Father over the nations, over the cosmos. And of course, he will renew this earth and create for us an enduring home, an ever-enduring city for us to enjoy his presence in perpetually for all time. And until that moment comes, we are not to just simply hunker down and wait for those promises to be fulfilled, but we are to, as pilgrims and as exiles, know that this is not our true, lasting, permanent home, or at least the version we live in currently. But someday, when it's renewed, it will be. And until then, we are looking for the city whose builder and maker is God, and inviting all others to join us in that pursuit. And we are calling them to recognize the God of Israel for who he is and what he has done, and that he is offering them the most gracious gift that any of us could ever hope for, and thankfully do not have to do a single thing in order to merit. And that even though we may make some silly decisions along the way, and we may think that we know what's best for us at times, and we make bad choices using conventional wisdom, and that most people would agree was the smart move, the right play to make. And yet ultimately the Lord is telling us, convicting us at every step along the way, trying to help grab our attention and show us he has something better, but yet we opt for what we think is better than what he can give. And yet he is still faithful. That doesn't mean he necessarily gives us what he would have originally intended, but he still brings about our good and ultimately his glory. So thank you for listening. I hope this has been informative and educational, and I hope it sets us up for what we can expect in the weeks to come as we continue to unpack Saul's story leading into David's, and seeing the extreme juxtaposition and the dichotomization of these two men. Because Saul, as we can appreciate the fact that he is head and shoulders taller than everybody else, this goes back to what Hannah had said when she says, do not talk boastfully or proudly. The Hebrew words there are the same, even though they're translated as two different words in English, is Geboah. Do not talk Geboah, or tall, because Geboah, in its truest essence or most basic premise, in Hebrew basically means tall. It's the exact same word used to describe both Saul and even the Philistine that David fights, Goliath, that both of them are tall. And we know that David's worst enemy at that point in the story is the Philistine giant. But sadly, in the years that come after that, the one who pursues him is the Israelite giant, who is just as tyrannical over the people as Goliath was hoping to be when he issued the challenge that if we beat you, you will serve us. You will become our slaves. And per the words of Samuel right here in 1 Samuel 8, after the initial phase of Saul's installation as king, which it seems to go quite well for a moment, the Lord outsourced, or I should say outfitted and resourced him with everything he needed. The Lord began to change his heart. The Lord did not prop him up as something of a patsy or a fall guy, so that when he slips and falls hard, the Lord can say, hey, see, this is what happens when you guys ask for something. Now let me do it the right way. He gave Saul every possible chance of stepping into the limelight and becoming a new Adam, because he gave him his spirit. He would help him understand the wisdom of his counsel if Saul would give his heart to the Lord. And the Lord made it possible for him to do so by changing his heart by his spirit. This was an advantage that none of the other Israelites had. And yet, what do we see Saul doing? Don't want to steal too much thunder of what's to come in the weeks ahead. but just to see how this all begins to fit together. So anyway, thanks for listening. Let's close our time in prayer. Lord Jesus, we are grateful. And I pray that you would expand our horizons today even more than what we have come to understand by us digging deeper in the days and weeks to come as we read through this text, as we hear it preached to us, as we may go and explore other educational resources outside of the Bible to see the insights that you have given others. And I pray, Lord, that you will help us to turn back to this in praise and, of course, to understand how this influences the story that we all have become a part of in the New Testament. We thank you and love you. In your name we pray. Amen.